we've been asked to address two questions. One is, what is philosophy? And the other, what is the value of philosophy? Now, let me start answering the first question by an anecdote. In 1984, I was part of a reading group of Oxford philosophers in the Welsh countryside, and on a walk during an intermission, we met a Welsh farmer, and he asked us what we were doing in these remote parts, and we told him that we were discussing philosophy. On hearing this, he was beside himself with laughter, but once he had regained control, he said, "Working hard during the week and getting pissed over the weekend, that's my philosophy." Now, you know, what this shows is that the label philosophy is used for a very wide range of topics, questions, pursuits, activities. Nevertheless, perhaps there are two unifying features. One is that philosophizing has an intellectual dimension. To philosophize means to engage, your rational capacities, your capacities for reasoning. And the other potentially unifying feature is that philosophy engages these capacities with respect to very general and fundamental issues. Even the statement of the Welsh farmer expresses his conviction about what he wants to do in life. So it's general and is also very fundamental. And, in current terminology, we might say he was addressing the life-work balance problem. And this is, at least one topic in moral psychology. So now, even in academic, it is the kind of question which is addressed in academic philosophy. Now, my conception of philosophy is very much part of that academic tradition, and it revolves around two convictions. One is that one task of academic philosophy, and an essential one, is what I call critical thinking writ large. And the other conviction is that conceptual analysis is part of critical thinking writ large. So let me first explain critical thinking. Writ large is important here because all academic disciplines engage in critical thinking. However, they often do so in a way which leaves certain fundamental assumptions untouched. Physics would be going nowhere fast if it constantly questioned, whether empirical evidence is relevant, whether the formal methods of mathematics are relevant. But at the same time, there's also a need for addressing these fundamental questions. And that is indeed what really characterizes philosophy. So philosophy doesn't just, sort of provide answers to certain questions. It doesn't merely, develop methods for answering these questions. It also raises the issue, which questions are worth asking. It also raises the issue, what methods should we employ in determining which questions should be tackled and how. So, in philosophy, all assumptions and all notions are subject to critical scrutiny. For instance, philosophers ask, well, does physics merely describe how events in the natural world evolve, or does it explain why they happen? This is a far from trivial issue. So at this point, it's worth emphasizing that philosophy doesn't just engage in critical thinking and at a very fundamental level, it also develops methods for critical thinking and improves these methods. So it is very much the home of formal and informal logic, of conceptual explication, of rational choice theory, etc., etc. So, all of these things, I think, are rightly seen as part of, or at least continuous with, philosophy. So, that much for critical thinking writ large. My second conviction is that conceptual analysis is a very important part of critical thinking writ large. Conceptual analysis tries to address issues of a conceptual nature. It tries to elucidate the concepts which are used in particular questions, in particular answers to these questions, which are invoked in certain methods for answering these questions. And this is very much important because without getting clear about what the expressions used in a question or used in an answer to these questions mean, we don't know what question is being raised, and we don't know, what, for instance, follows from what claim. So, the idea of elucidating the concepts is very much part of also formal and informal logic. Only when we are clear about what is being claimed can we establish what follows from what, or what is excluded by what. So, let me now illustrate this with respect to a question that has increasingly exercised cognitive scientists and philosophers. I call it the question of animal minds. And, in its most primitive version, it goes like this. Do some non-human animals have mental capacities?
Yeah.
This issue, the answer to this issue, or the answer to this question, depends, I think, quite trivially but importantly, on two factors. On the one hand, it depends on facts about non-human animals. What can they do? How can they respond to their environment? What sorts of problems can they solve, and how? So that's one aspect. So, you can only answer that question by looking at contingent facts, and that is done by empirical science. But the answer, of course, also depends on what you make of, the idea of a mind, what you make of mental notions like perceiving, sensing, thinking, reasoning, etc. So, we have an interplay between factual issues to be settled by empirical science and conceptual issues to be clarified by philosophy. Now, my version of conceptual analysis, I call it impure conceptual analysis, differs from more orthodox versions in two respects. One respect is that the interplay between factual and conceptual issues is much more dynamic than these orthodox views of conceptual analysis allow. We cannot, in a Socratic manner, first define our terms. This is, if you wish, a first-year undergraduate idea. First, define your terms, and then, everything else falls into play. Rather, the clarification of concepts and their application in empirical and non-empirical theorizing go hand in hand. And the second respect in which my conception of a conceptual analysis differs from orthodox version is that I allow for types of problems that lie between or bridge the gulf between conceptual and factual problems, namely problems of a methodological nature.
Yeah.
Very often, what methods to employ, is, not just a matter of what works in a particular branch of empirical science, but it's also guided by certain general principles. But at the same time, these principles, cannot just be developed in an armchair. One methodological principle which is related to this question of animal minds that I mentioned previously is Morgan's canon, a principle of comparative psychology developed in the 19th century. Morgan held that in no case may we explain animal behavior by reference to a higher psychological faculty if it can also be explained by reference to a lower psychological faculty. Now, sounds reasonable, but then immediately you might ask, is parsimony the one and only methodological principle that we should heed in empirical science? Or aren't other virtues like explanatory power, facility of explanation, etc., equally valuable? And then, the equally pertinent question, well, you can't simply say this works in empirical science because, what does or does not work is subject to certain epistemic considerations, very fundamental epistemic considerations that philosophy also, addresses. Okay, this is more than enough on what philosophy is. It's not an answer to that question. It's an attempt to lay out what my conception of philosophy is, of academic philosophy. Concerning the other question, what is the value of philosophy? Now, I think I've made things easy for myself with this idea of critical thinking writ large, because I think it stands to reason that critical thinking is not just valuable, but essential. It's particularly essential in constellations in which certain fundamental assumptions have become questionable or are contested. Just consider current controversies about climate change. Yeah? These controversies raise some issues of, the kind that my kind of philosophy addresses. For instance, is there such a thing as probabilistic knowledge? Is there knowledge which arises out of models or modeling? Or perhaps most prominent of all, given the fallibility of empirical scientific theorizing, is it justified to base practical decisions of very weighty consequences on the findings, the fallible findings of science? So that seems to me to be as important a question as there can be in current times. Now, this point about the importance of critical thinking also applies to conceptual analysis. What is a mind, what is it to possess a mind type of questions are not posed, as a kind of amusement. Yeah? They're not l'art pour l'art, but they are raised out of concerns of a different kind. So even Socrates, his infamous "what is virtue" question was not simply a way of showing that his Athenian compatriots didn't know what they were talking about. It was motivated by an interest in the question of whether virtue can be taught. Yeah. A very important practical issue even to this day. And the same goes for the what is questions in current analytic philosophy. So, for instance, what is freedom, what is responsibility, of obvious importance to legal theorizing and thereby to legal practice. Or just turning back to this question of animal minds, we ask whether animals have minds for very fundamental theoretical and practical reasons. The theoretical reason is, it's very important to get clear about this question in order to compare our place in nature with that of animals. And it's also of obvious practical relevance to animal ethics and animal welfare. How should we treat animals? What sorts of treatment, register with them? Is it just pain? Is it frustration of intentions, etc.? So, in sum, I think that critical thinking writ large is a very good illustration of Russell's phrase that philosophy, more specifically analytic philosophy, is cold steel in the hand of passion. It's the cold steel of conceptual explication, of formal logic, of informal logic, of theories, of arguments, etc., wielded in a passionate manner in order to address certain burning issues. In the first instance, these issues are cognitive, namely, we wield these instruments, we wield the cold steel of analytic philosophy in order to promote intellectual virtues like clarity of questions and stringency of argument, but by doing so we also contribute to a better way of addressing issues of a practical nature, for instance, in legal theory or in the way in which we should respond to climate science.